On a seemingly ordinary flight, an unsettling confrontation unfolded in first class, captivating the attention of everyone on board. What began as a quiet trip for a couple escalated when a flight attendant questioned their right to be there, calling security in the process. But just moments later, the situation shifted in a way no one anticipated, leaving the entire cabin silent. As we dive into this gripping story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy stories like these, don't forget to like and subscribe. The commotion began in the first-class cabin of Flight 612 from Belmont to Newport. Passengers were still settling into their seats, tucking bags overhead and preparing for departure. Yet, murmurs spread as voices began to rise near the front of the cabin. At the center of it all was Emma Briggs, a flight attendant with 10 years of experience under her belt. She stood rigidly before a couple, Nathan and Olivia Walsh. The Walshes, both dressed in sleek, understated attire, exuded quiet confidence. Nathan, the co-founder of a tech firm, and Olivia, a civil rights attorney, had planned a brief escape from their hectic lives. Their first-class tickets had been booked far in advance and scanned without issue at the gate, but peace was short-lived. Emma held a manifest in one hand, eyes fixed on them with thinly veiled suspicion. Her tone, though polite, carried a clear bite. "I'll need to see your tickets again," she said, loud enough for several passengers nearby to overhear. Nathan calmly retrieved his boarding pass, extending it to her without hesitation. Olivia followed, handing hers over with an unwavering hand. Emma inspected the tickets, flipping them over, scrutinizing them once more. Her frown deepened. After an uncomfortable pause, she returned the tickets with a sharp nod. "I'll be back," she said curtly, retreating toward the galley. Olivia leaned toward Nathan, keeping her voice low. "This feels off," she murmured. Nathan's jaw tightened slightly. "Let's stay calm. We haven't done anything wrong." But staying calm wasn't easy. Across the aisle, a passenger in his 50s, who had been casually flipping through a magazine, looked over. "Everything all right?" he asked in a hushed tone. Nathan nodded briefly. "It's fine," he replied, though the concern on the man's face didn't fade. Several minutes later, Emma returned, her demeanor now carrying an air of finality. She leaned closer to them, her voice icier than before. "I'm gonna have to ask you both to come with me. There seems to be an issue with your seating." Olivia's brows narrowed ever so slightly. "These are our seats," she replied firmly. "There shouldn't be an issue." Emma's face hardened. "We can discuss this in the galley." The murmurs around them grew louder. Nathan rose smoothly from his seat, retrieving his coat from the hook. Olivia followed with the same poise, sliding her bag over one shoulder. As they stepped into the aisle, the eyes of the other passengers followed their every move. Emma led them to the narrow space near the galley and crossed her arms. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," she said flatly. "These seats aren't yours." Olivia's head tilted slightly, her voice calm but unwavering. "Our tickets were scanned at the gate and verified. There's no mistake." Emma's posture stiffened. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have to call security." Nathan's gaze didn't waver as he slowly took out his phone. "Before you do," he said in a quiet, controlled voice, "make sure you're certain about this." Emma's frown deepened, but for the first time there was hesitation in her eyes. Back in the first-class cabin, passengers exchanged uneasy glances. One man crossed his arms, shaking his head. "Something isn't right about this," he muttered. Meanwhile, Emma's voice grew sharper. "I've explained the situation," she repeated, though the slightest tremor crept into her tone. Olivia, unmoved, retrieved her phone and began dialing. Nathan took a step back, positioning his phone to discreetly record the interaction. "This is unacceptable," he said evenly. "We're not going anywhere unless you provide a valid explanation." Emma's lips thinned. "Sir, I don't need to explain myself further. If you refuse to comply, I'll be forced to escalate this." Olivia pressed the phone to her ear. "Hello," she said, her voice professional but firm. "This is Olivia Walsh. My husband and I are on Flight 612, seated in first class. We're being asked to vacate our seats without any clear reason, despite having valid tickets. Could you assist with this matter?" Emma's expression flickered, her confidence visibly shaken by Olivia's call. "Who are you calling?" Emma demanded sharply. Olivia met her gaze coolly. "I'm contacting someone who can clarify the situation." The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. Passengers leaned into the aisle, trying to catch a glimpse of the standoff near the galley. As Olivia continued speaking, Emma's hands fidgeted at her sides. Nathan glanced at his phone's timer. 7 minutes had passed since this began. "Just give it a little longer," Olivia whispered to Nathan as she hung up, slipping the phone back into her bag. Emma's frustration simmered, but Nathan and Olivia's unshakable calm sent a ripple through the air. Neither side knew it yet, but the next few minutes would change the course of the flight, and perhaps much more. Olivia waited a moment, her phone pressed to her ear. "Hello," she said, her voice steady and unmistakably firm. "This is Olivia Walsh. My husband and I are on flight 612 in first class. We're being told we cannot remain in our seats despite holding valid tickets. Can you assist us with this matter?" Nathan caught the faintest flicker in Emma's expression, confusion, maybe even doubt. "Who are you calling?" Emma interrupted sharply. "I told you this is a security matter." Olivia calmly ignored her, continuing the call. "Yes, we're still on the plane. I'll text you the details now." She ended the call, typing quickly and deliberately. Emma's patience thinned visibly. "This isn't going to change anything," she snapped, her irritation seeping through her professional facade. In the first-class cabin, a man in a charcoal suit leaned toward a flight attendant standing quietly by the service cart. "This doesn't feel right," he murmured. The attendant, Claire Matthews, nodded subtly but said nothing. Her eyes flicked toward the galley, concern etched across her face as if she debated stepping in. Moments later, Emma strode toward the galley phone, her heels striking the floor with sharp purpose. Passengers discreetly turned their heads, trying to eavesdrop without being obvious. "This is Emma in first class. I need security at gate 18 immediately," she said briskly into the phone. "We have 2 passengers refusing to comply." Nathan and Olivia exchanged a glance. Olivia's face remained impassive, but Nathan's eyebrow lifted slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching as if suppressing a reaction. Emma hung up, folding her arms tightly. "They'll be here shortly," she said coldly. "I suggest you cooperate before this escalates further." But Olivia stayed composed, sliding her phone back into her purse. "We'll wait," she replied simply, her voice as calm as still water. Emma hesitated for a moment, seemingly caught off guard by Olivia's unwavering confidence. Without another word, she turned and disappeared through the curtain, likely to confer with the rest of the crew. As silence filled the galley, Nathan leaned against the wall. "What did they say?" he asked quietly. "They're handling it," Olivia replied, glancing briefly toward the front of the cabin. "Just give it a few more minutes." Nathan nodded, his gaze dropping to the screen of his phone as he checked the time. Footsteps echoed behind them. Emma returned, her face stiff with a forced sense of authority. The hum of the plane seemed to dull as passengers watched the situation unfold with increasing interest. Claire followed a few steps behind Emma, her eyes soft with concern. "Security is on the way," Emma announced loudly, ensuring nearby passengers could hear. "I suggest you prepare to leave the plane." Olivia looked at Nathan, unaffected by Emma's tone. "That won't be necessary," she said quietly but firmly. Emma stopped mid-step, blinking as if she misheard. Claire shifted uncomfortably beside her, glancing between the couple and Emma. "Emma," Claire began carefully, "maybe we should check with the captain first. This doesn't feel—" "I've got this." "Claire," Emma interrupted sharply, her tone clipped and unyielding. Claire stepped back, pressing her lips into a thin line, though her eyes lingered on Olivia and Nathan, offering a silent apology. Nathan glanced at his phone once more. 7 minutes, he murmured under his breath. Olivia met his gaze, her lips curling into the faintest smile. "Patience," she whispered. Emma's confidence faltered ever so slightly. Her gaze darted between the couple and the curtains separating the galley from first class. "You can record all you want," Emma snapped, suddenly addressing Nathan directly. "It doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of—" "Violation of what?" Olivia interjected smoothly. Emma hesitated, thrown off by the interruption. "We've shown you our tickets. They're valid," Olivia continued, her tone even. "We've cooperated and remained respectful. Meanwhile, you've escalated this situation unnecessarily. So I'll ask again, what exactly are we violating?" Emma's jaw tightened. "It's not about," she began, but her words hung unfinished as the galley phone buzzed sharply. Claire instinctively moved to answer, but Emma lifted her hand, stopping her. "I'll get it," she said stiffly, though her tone lacked the edge it once had. She picked up the receiver, her posture tense. "This is Emma," she said, casting a brief glance toward Nathan and Olivia. As she listened, her face hardened, then softened into something unwritable. "Yes, sir," she finally said, her voice noticeably quieter. "Understood." Emma hung up, her back to the couple. Claire took a cautious step forward. "What is it?" Claire asked softly. Emma turned slowly, her complexion pale. "The captain wants to see me," she muttered. Without another word, she brushed past Claire and disappeared through the curtain, clang, leaving Nathan and Olivia standing alone in the galley. Claire lingered, finally approaching the couple with hesitant warmth. "Is there anything I can get you?" she asked, her voice gentle but uncertain. Olivia smiled kindly. "Thank you, Claire. We're fine for now." Claire nodded and retreated, glancing toward the curtain with unease as the murmurs of passengers drifted faintly through the cabin. Claire hesitated, then stepped toward Nathan and Olivia. "Is there anything I can get you?" she asked quietly, her voice warm but edged with uncertainty. Olivia offered a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Claire. We're fine for now." Claire nodded and took a step back, though the unease lingered in her eyes. As the seconds stretched on, whispers drifted through the cabin again, passengers exchanging hushed speculation. Nathan leaned casually against the galley wall, his phone still in hand. Olivia crossed her arms, gazing calmly out the small window. They didn't speak, but the faint glances they shared spoke volumes. Time was ticking, and they both knew it. Meanwhile, Emma walked briskly toward the cockpit, her pulse racing as she replayed the phone call from the ground office. The captain's tone had left no room for debate. At the cockpit door, she drew in a breath and knocked lightly. It swung open to reveal Captain Reynolds, his seasoned features unreadable. "Come in," he said, his voice calm but firm. Emma stepped inside, immediately feeling the weight of the cockpit's quiet, controlled atmosphere. The co-pilot glanced at her briefly before returning to the flight instruments. Captain Reynolds gestured to the jump seat. "Sit down. We need to discuss the situation in first class." Emma perched stiffly on the edge of the seat, her hands folding nervously in her lap. "I've been handling it, Captain," she said quickly. "The passengers refused to comply, so I called security to intervene." Captain Reynolds narrowed his eyes, his tone cooling. "Refused to comply with what, exactly?" Emma blinked, the question hanging uncomfortably in the air. I believe there was a mistake," she faltered. "They didn't seem..." Emma stopped, realizing the explanation crumbled under scrutiny. Captain Reynolds' expression hardened. "I reviewed their tickets after receiving a call from headquarters. They're valid. Both of them." Emma's breath caught. "There's no reason why Nathan and Olivia Walsh shouldn't be seated in first class," he continued, his voice dropping with weight. "In fact, Mrs. Walsh has direct connections to senior leadership at the airline." Emma felt her stomach drop. "Connected to leadership?" she repeated weakly. The captain nodded. "She's already contacted them regarding this incident. The executive team has requested a full report by the time we land. Furthermore, they've directed me to ensure the Walshes are treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of this flight." Emma's face paled as cold realization washed over her. "I didn't know," she mumbled, barely able to meet his gaze. "That much is clear," Captain Harris said sharply. "You acted on assumption rather than fact, and now the airline is dealing with the consequences." Emma's head dipped. "You'll return to the cabin and make no further decisions regarding these passengers. Do I make myself clear?" Emma swallowed, nodding. "Yes, Captain." "Good." Dismissed. Emma left the cockpit in a daze, her footsteps unsteady as she made her way back toward the first-class cabin. Her thoughts swirled with panic, the weight of her mistake pressing heavier with each step. Passengers' gazes flickered toward her as she re-entered first class. Some exchanged subtle glances, sensing the shift in her demeanor. Emma kept her eyes down, walking briskly past the galley without daring to look at Nathan or Olivia. Nathan glanced at Olivia, the faintest smirk curling at the corner of his lips. Neither said a word. The silence between them was filled with quiet understanding. Nearby, Claire lingered by the drink cart, pretending to organize cups but keeping a careful eye on the couple. Her concern was evident, though she kept it hidden behind the mask of her duties. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, an ordinary signal, but this time it felt heavier. Claire's eyes flicked to the curtain just as Emma stepped out, her movements slower, shoulders slightly slumped as though the weight of the captain's words physically bore down on her. Emma halted near the galley, hesitating before approaching Nathan and Olivia. Her face was tight with forced professionalism, though the lingering discomfort was impossible to miss. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh," Emma began, her voice lacking the sharp edge it once carried. "I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience caused earlier. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Olivia's gaze met Emma's squarely, her expression cool but unreadable. "A misunderstanding," Olivia repeated, her voice soft yet threaded with unmistakable steel. Emma flinched ever so slightly. "Yes," she answered quickly, as if eager to move past the moment. Olivia's gaze held steady as Emma rushed to fill the silence. "It appears there was an error on my part. I assure you, it won't happen again," Emma said, her words quick but hollow. Nathan tilted his head slightly, watching Emma with a calm that didn't mask the sharpness in his eyes. "You've gone through a lot of effort to remove us over an error," he said, his voice level but carrying enough weight to make Emma shift uncomfortably. Olivia leaned back, crossing her arms. "We appreciate the apology," she said coolly, though her tone left no doubt that it wasn't nearly enough. "But I hope you realize this goes beyond inconvenience." Emma nodded stiffly, her throat tightening. The air in the cabin felt heavier. "Of course," she replied in a near whisper. "I'll ensure everything is handled properly for the rest of your flight." Before Nathan or Olivia could respond, Claire stepped forward, her movements careful but with quiet resolve. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked softly, her tone a warm contrast to Emma's tension. "Water? Tea?" Olivia's expression softened as she turned to Claire. "Thank you. A glass of water would be fine." Claire nodded, quickly retrieving a glass and setting it down on the small tray in front of Olivia. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask," she said, sincerity clear in her voice. As Claire stepped back, Emma lingered awkwardly, as if considering saying more. But the weight of the couple's quiet, unwavering confidence kept her rooted in place. Finally, she muttered another apology under her breath and walked briskly toward the first-class section, her steps noticeably quicker, as if trying to escape. Nathan and Olivia exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. There was nothing left to say. The balance of power had shifted. Nathan glanced at his phone, the soft glow lighting his face. "Any minute now," he said quietly, the calm and anticipation in his voice almost deliberate. Olivia sipped her water, her gaze steady. "Let her sweat," she murmured. "She has no idea what's coming." Emma's hurried footsteps carried her back to the first-class galley, but she could feel the weight of passengers' stares as if they were physical. The silent judgment followed her, burning at the edges of her composure. In the galley, Nathan and Olivia remained seated, serene yet unwavering, as though the outcome was already written. The hum of the plane felt louder against the quiet tension hanging in the air. Emma barely had time to catch her breath when a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Emma." She turned sharply to see David, the senior flight attendant, approaching with measured steps. His expression was calm, but his gaze held an edge that made Emma tense. "The captain just radioed in," David said in a low voice. "We received another call from the executive office. They're monitoring the situation closely." Emma's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice faltering. David folded his arms, his expression growing firmer. "It means they aren't happy. They've requested a full report on your actions, and the captain's made it clear there's no room for further mistakes." Emma's face paled. She leaned against the counter, grasping for some semblance of control. "I was just doing my job," she muttered defensively. David shook his head. "Was it your job to call security on 2 passengers with valid tickets?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "You've put the entire crew in a difficult position." Back in the main cabin, Nathan and Olivia sat quietly, their calm masking the quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Olivia glanced at Nathan, her voice soft. "Any response yet?" Nathan checked his phone and nodded. "They're ready, just waiting on the next move." Olivia leaned back, her composure steady. "Good. It's time they understand who they're dealing with." Meanwhile, The murmurs of passengers began rippling through the cabin. The man who had spoken to Nathan earlier leaned toward the woman beside him. "Do you think they'll really call the police over this?" he asked under his breath. The woman shook her head, her expression disapproving. "They shouldn't even be dealing with this. That flight attendant clearly has something against them." Discontent quietly brewed among the passengers, spreading like wildfire. More heads turned toward the galley, whispers growing louder. Emma, fully aware of the shift, tried to distract herself by tidying the drink cart. But even the smallest tasks felt meaningless under the weight of the eyes on her. Then the phone at the galley buzzed sharply. David picked it up, his face unreadable as he listened. When he hung up, his eyes met Emma's. "It's the captain," David said simply. "He wants to see you. Now." Emma froze, her breath catching. "What now?" she whispered, though she already suspected the answer. David's gaze didn't waver. "I think you know." Emma hesitated, but the weight of his words left little room for argument. She straightened her uniform and walked toward the cockpit, each step heavier than the last. Behind her, the whispers of the passengers continued, relentless and unavoidable. Emma's heart pounded as she reached the cockpit door. For a brief moment she hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. Then she knocked softly, and the door opened. As Emma's hand hovered over the cockpit door, she took a slow, shaky breath. Finally she knocked. The door creaked open, and Captain Reynolds stood there, his eyes hard and unreadable. Without a word, he motioned for her to step inside. "Emma," he began, his voice sharp and unwavering. "We just received another call from headquarters. This situation has escalated beyond my authority. Leadership is involved and they've issued direct orders." Emma's throat tightened. "Orders?" she asked, barely above a whisper. The captain leaned forward slightly, his gaze unrelenting. "Effective immediately. You are to be removed from this flight. Security will escort you off once we land. Your actions have not only disrupted the passengers, but you've drawn attention at the highest level. They want accountability, and they're starting with you." Emma's heart pounded. "Captain, this can't be serious. I was following protocol." "Enough," Captain Reynolds interrupted, his tone ice cold. "This isn't about protocol. It's about the choices you made, the assumptions, the unnecessary confrontation. There's no justification for it. And now, this airline is facing repercussions because of you." Emma's face turned pale. Her hands trembled at her sides. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but the captain lifted his hand, cutting her off. "This decision is final," he said. "Return to the galley and complete your duties until we land. After that, security will take over." Dismissed. Emma's legs felt weak as she stepped out of the cockpit. The door clicked shut behind her. But the weight of the conversation clung to her like a storm cloud. As she moved down the aisle, the soft murmurs from passengers seemed louder. Every glance in her direction felt heavier, as if they could hear the captain's words echoing in her head. In the galley, Nathan and Olivia exchanged a quiet glance as Emma reappeared. Though her face was neutral, her stiff posture betrayed her. Claire, who had been standing nearby, approached hesitantly. "Emma, is everything all right?" she asked gently, concern in her voice. Emma's jaw tightened. She shook her head quickly, not meeting Claire's eyes. "Just focus on your job," she snapped, though her words lacked the authority they once carried. Claire stepped back, her expression unreadable as she returned to assisting the other passengers. Meanwhile, Nathan checked his phone once more and gave a slight nod to Olivia. "They've landed at headquarters," he murmured. Olivia's lips curved into a subtle smile. "Good," she said softly. "Let's wrap this up." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted further. Emma could feel it, as if the air itself was pressing down on her. Claire moved quietly through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. Her warm demeanor was a stark contrast to Emma's icy one earlier in the flight. Passengers began to take notice of the change. Some even whispered about what had happened in the galley. Emma, pretending to organize napkins, felt the weight of their stares. Her hands trembled with every movement, and the captain's words replayed in her mind like a broken record. Nathan and Olivia, however, remained composed. Olivia adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, her movements precise and graceful. "Do you think she realizes what's coming?" Olivia asked, not taking her eyes off the glass of water in front of her. Nathan's voice was calm but resolute. "She knows something's wrong, but she doesn't understand just how serious this is. Olivia's lips curled faintly. She will. A few rows away, a man leaned toward another passenger. "This whole thing's ridiculous," he whispered. "I saw their tickets at boarding. There was no mistake. That flight attendant's acting like—" He trailed off, shaking his head. The other passenger nodded grimly. "She didn't think they belonged here," she replied quietly. "Now she's paying for it." In the galley, David approached Emma cautiously. His brow furrowed with concern as he lowered his voice. "Emma, you need to hold it together until we land. Making a scene now will only make it worse." Emma stiffened. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she muttered, frustration edging into her tone. David crossed his arms. "That doesn't change anything. You let assumptions guide your decisions, and now the entire crew is under scrutiny because of you." Emma said nothing, but his words cut deep. Back in the cabin, Olivia's phone buzzed softly. She glanced at the message, then nodded. "They're ready for us when we land," she said to Nathan. He smiled faintly. "Perfect timing." As the plane began its descent, Captain Reynolds' voice broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in the upright position. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Claire moved gracefully through the aisles, offering smiles and adjusting seatbelts. When she reached Nathan and Olivia, she paused. "Is there anything else I can get you before we land?" she asked warmly. Olivia smiled. "No, thank you, Claire. You've been wonderful." Claire's cheeks flushed slightly. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said before stepping away. Emma, standing just a few steps away in the galley, overheard the exchange. The contrast between Claire's professionalism and her own tense behavior was undeniable. As the plane touched down, a quiet but collective sigh filled the cabin. But for Emma, the real anxiety was just beginning. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and passengers slowly began gathering their belongings. Emma remained near the galley, stiff and pale, as the first uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane. Passengers near the exit slowed, watching as the officer quietly spoke to the captain. Emma's breath caught as the officer's gaze shifted toward her. David stepped aside as the officer approached. "Emma Scott?" Emma swallowed hard. "Yes," she whispered. "We've been instructed to escort you off the plane for questioning." Emma's face burned as she fumbled for her bag. Passengers whispered behind her, their curiosity impossible to ignore. Nathan and Olivia calmly gathered their belongings, standing aside as Emma passed them. Olivia's gaze met Emma's briefly. There was no malice, just unwavering calm. Emma looked away. As Emma stepped off the plane with the security officers, the tension seemed to lift. Claire exhaled softly. "Thank you both," she said to Nathan and Olivia. "You did your job with integrity." Olivia replied warmly. "That's all anyone can ask for." As Nathan leaned back in his seat, his gaze drifted out the window, watching the sprawling cityscape below. "Good," he said quietly, crossing his arms. "Let's make sure this gets handled the right way." A soft chime echoed through the cabin, followed by the calm voice of Captain Reynolds. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure your tray tables are in the upright position. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Passengers stirred, shuffling to adjust seatbelts and gather their belongings. Olivia exchanged a glance with Nathan but remained seated, her phone resting lightly on her lap. Across the aisle, Claire moved down the rows with effortless grace, checking seatbelts and flashing warm smiles. When she reached Nathan and Olivia, her expression softened. "Can I get you anything before we land?" she asked gently. Olivia smiled, shaking her head. "Thank you, Claire. You've been wonderful." Claire's cheeks flushed faintly. "I'm glad to hear that. If you need anything else, just let me know," she replied softly, moving toward the back of the plane. Just a few steps away, Emma lingered stiffly by the galley, the drink cart sitting untouched. The contrast between Claire's warm professionalism and Emma's unraveling composure could not have been more obvious. As the descent continued, hushed conversations rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged curious glances, their murmurs barely concealed. Some muttered about how unfairly the situation had been handled, while others leaned closer to the aisle, hoping to catch a glimpse of Emma, who remained near the galley with tense shoulders and twitching hands. Olivia's phone vibrated softly. She glanced at the screen and leaned toward Nathan, her voice barely above a whisper. They're in position. She's not getting off this flight unnoticed. Nathan's gaze remained fixed ahead, calm and unwavering. Emma's gaze flickered nervously toward the exit as she adjusted the same row of napkins for the third time. Each time a passenger glanced her way, her back straightened, as if she could somehow maintain authority through sheer willpower. David, watching from the opposite side of the galley, stepped closer. His voice was quiet but firm. Emma, you can't outrun this. It's already out of your control. Emma's grip on the cart tightened. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she muttered, her voice defensive but hollow. I was just doing my job. David crossed his arms, his expression unimpressed. No, you weren't. This wasn't about the job. You made assumptions and you acted on them. Now the entire crew and the airline are paying for it. Emma opened her mouth to respond but froze when the front cabin door opened. A uniformed security officer stepped inside, scanning the plane briefly before approaching Captain Reynolds, who had emerged from the cockpit. The conversation between the two men was short but serious. Emma's stomach twisted as the officer's gaze inevitably shifted to her. Her heart pounded. She tried to stay composed, but the way her hand trembled as she pushed the cart aside betrayed her. Passengers near the exit slowed, whispering among themselves as the officer walked toward Emma. The attention of the entire cabin seemed to narrow to the galley, where she stood frozen in place. David took a step back, offering Emma no reprieve. Emma Scott? The officer asked calmly, though his tone left no room for doubt. Emma swallowed hard. Yes, she said quietly. We've been instructed to escort you off the plane for further questioning. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she quickly grabbed her bag, trying to appear composed. This isn't necessary, she mumbled under her breath, but the officer remained unmoved. Passengers watched closely as Emma was led down the aisle. Her eyes flickered nervously toward Nathan and Olivia as she passed. Olivia's gaze met Emma's for just a moment, a quiet, calm resolve that made Emma look away. The couple gathered their belongings without a word. By the time Emma stepped off the plane, the mood inside the cabin shifted. The tension that had lingered like a thick cloud dissipated, leaving behind a sense of quiet relief. Claire exhaled softly as she approached Nathan and Olivia near the exit. Thank you both, she said sincerely. Olivia smiled. You handled everything with grace, Claire. We'll be sure to mention that to your leadership. Claire's eyes glistened with gratitude. That means a lot. I just hope everything's resolved the right way. It will be, Nathan replied, his voice steady. It already is. Passengers filed off the plane one by one, but Nathan and Olivia took their time, allowing the crowd to thin. Outside the aircraft, Emma stood stiffly near the gate, flanked by the security officer. Her gaze remained fixed on the floor as the officer spoke quietly into his radio. Nathan and Olivia stepped past without a second glance. Once inside the terminal, Olivia's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the message and smirked faintly. It's already being handled. They're drafting a statement for release by morning. Nathan chuckled softly as they walked toward baggage claim. They're nervous. They should be, Olivia replied, tucking her phone into her bag. They just learned what happens when you underestimate the wrong people. As they exited into the bustling terminal, Nathan glanced at Olivia. Do you think she realizes the weight of what just happened? She will, Olivia said quietly. But this wasn't just about her. It's about making sure this never happens again. Nathan nodded. We've started something. Olivia's gaze was steady. And we're gonna finish it. Their seats. Rachel sat across from them, flipping open a slim notebook and setting her tablet carefully on the table. First, let me personally apologize for what happened during your flight, Rachel began, her tone professional but sincere. It was unacceptable, and I assure you we take this very seriously. Olivia crossed her legs, her expression calm but unyielding. I appreciate the apology, she replied smoothly. But I think you understand this is about more than just one flight attendant's behavior. Rachel nodded, folding her hands on the table. We do. And I want you to know that steps are already being taken. Miss Scott has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation, and our training programs are under immediate review. We're committed to addressing the root cause, not just the symptoms. Nathan glanced at Olivia, who remained composed but clearly skeptical. Training is a start, Olivia said, but addressing this after the fact isn't enough. There needs to be accountability at every level. Passengers shouldn't have to defend themselves in a situation like this. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. I completely agree. That's why we're involving external consultants to overhaul our approach to bias training and customer relations. We'd like to invite you to be part of that process if you're willing. Nathan raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. Olivia considered the offer carefully, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of her chair. I'd be open to that, she said at last. But I expect regular updates and measurable progress. This can't just be for show. Rachel smiled faintly, nodding. Of course, we want to make real changes, not just cover this up. As Rachel continued outlining the next steps, Olivia listened intently, occasionally exchanging brief glances with Nathan. When the meeting concluded, Rachel extended her hand. Thank you for your time and for your patience during all of this. Olivia shook her hand firmly. I'll be in touch, she replied, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had commanded the situation from the start. As Nathan and Olivia left the room, the quiet hum of the airport terminal filled the space around them. Nathan exhaled softly, rolling his shoulders as they walked. I think that went well, he said quietly. Olivia adjusted her scarf, glancing briefly toward the security checkpoint where Emma stood, still speaking with airport personnel. Her posture was slouched now, a stark contrast to the rigid authority she'd exuded just hours earlier. She's shaken, Olivia murmured, more to herself than to Nathan. Nathan nodded, watching Emma from a distance. Good, he said. She needed to be. But Olivia's gaze lingered a moment longer. This isn't just about Emma, she said, her voice soft but resolute. This is about making sure no one else has to deal with this. Nathan placed a hand gently on the small of her back as they continued toward baggage claim. And they won't, he replied, because you're making sure of it. As they waited by the carousel, the weight of the situation seemed to lift, if only slightly. Passengers from their flight shuffled around them, some offering polite nods or faint smiles in acknowledgement of the events they had all witnessed. One man approached quietly, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Excuse me, he said hesitantly, glancing between Nathan and Olivia. I just wanted to say I saw what happened, and I think the way you handled it was incredible. Olivia smiled warmly. Thank you, I appreciate that. The man nodded. I think a lot of people learned something from you today. As he walked away, Nathan glanced down at Olivia. He's right, you know. She smirked slightly, reaching for her suitcase as it rolled toward them. Well, she said, lifting the bag effortlessly, if nothing else, it's been a productive flight. Nathan chuckled softly, grabbing his own luggage. I'll say. As they left the terminal, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. Despite the ordeal, Olivia felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. They had stood their ground, and perhaps in doing so had opened the door for something better. For now, that was enough. Message. They're nervous, she added, setting the phone down. Nathan chuckled softly. They should be. I don't think they expected you to push this far. Olivia smirked but didn't look up. People rarely do. That's the problem. The sleek black sedan pulled into the driveway of their townhouse, the evening sun casting a golden glow over the clean glass facade. Nathan grabbed their bags from the trunk while Olivia unlocked the door, stepping inside the cool, quiet space. The hum of city life felt distant as Olivia set her phone on the marble kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water. The day had been long, but she wasn't tired. Not yet. Nathan placed the luggage near the stairs and leaned against the counter across from her. You know, we could have just let this go, he said with a small smile, though his eyes carried a hint of admiration. Olivia arched an eyebrow. And let her walk away without understanding the consequences? Not a chance. He laughed lightly. I knew you'd say that. Sipping her water, Olivia's gaze drifted to the window overlooking the city. It's not just about her, Nate, she said quietly. It's about what comes next. If no one holds them accountable, nothing changes. Nathan stepped closer, resting a hand on her back. I know. And that's why I love you. You don't back down, even when you probably should. Olivia smirked. Well, one of us has to keep things interesting. As Nathan kissed her lightly on the forehead, Olivia's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, reading the message with quiet satisfaction. "They're finalizing the investigation timeline," she said, scrolling through the details. "Looks like they want to wrap this up by the end of next week." "That's fast," Nathan said, crossing his arms. "Guess they're trying to make sure this doesn't blow up further." "Exactly," Olivia replied, setting the phone down. "But we'll see if it's just for show. I want to see real change, not just damage control." Nathan smiled knowingly. "They don't know who they're dealing with." "I'm counting on that," Olivia said, her tone light, but her meaning clear. The rest of the evening passed quietly, the weight of the day slowly dissolving into the calm of their home. But even as they unwound, Olivia's mind stayed sharp, already planning the next steps. Across the city, Emma Scott sat alone in her small apartment, staring blankly at her laptop screen. The notice from the airline sat open in her inbox, spelling out in clear, unrelenting terms what she had feared. Suspension, pending further review. Her phone, sitting beside the laptop, buzzed with messages from coworkers, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. The weight of what had happened, and how quickly it had spiraled, pressed heavily on her chest. Emma wasn't naive. She understood what had led her to this point. But the full realization of how her assumptions had driven the entire confrontation was harder to face. Her hand hovered over the keyboard as she debated how to respond to the HR department's request for a statement. After a long pause, she began typing. "To whom it may concern, I would like to formally acknowledge my actions on Flight 719 and take full responsibility for the events that transpired." The words were heavy, but necessary, and as she continued to write, she realized this wasn't just about salvaging her career. It was about confronting the truth she had ignored for too long. "Partnering with external consultants to overhaul their diversity and inclusion policies," she added, reading further. Nathan set his tablet down, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "It's a start," he said, "but I hope it's not just for show." Olivia glanced at him over the top of her laptop. "It won't be," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'll make sure of it." Nathan smirked. "I don't doubt that for a second." Their dining room was quiet, save for the soft hum of city life filtering in through the open window. Olivia closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, stretching slightly. "You know," she began, "when we boarded that flight, I thought we were leaving work behind for the weekend. Didn't expect to end up in the middle of all this." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, trouble has a way of finding us. Or maybe we just don't let things slide." Olivia countered with a small smile. Nathan reached across the table, gently squeezing her hand. "That's why I love you." Across town, Emma Scott sat at her kitchen table, the termination letter still lying open in front of her. She hadn't touched it for hours, unable to bring herself to reread the words. Her phone buzzed with another message from a former coworker. She ignored it, staring out the window at the darkening sky. Emma's mind replayed the flight in agonizing detail. The calm, deliberate way Olivia had handled the confrontation. Nathan's quiet confidence as he filmed the exchange. And the moment when Captain Reyes had told her, in no uncertain terms, that her career was over. She thought back to the passengers who had watched her fall apart, the quiet judgment in their eyes as she was escorted from the plane. Emma swallowed hard, but the lump in her throat didn't budge. Her pride had told her she was just enforcing policy, that she hadn't done anything wrong. But deep down, she knew better. She had let assumptions cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the price. Taking a shaky breath, Emma opened her laptop and began typing an email, not to the airline's legal team, but to Olivia Carter. Subject, a sincere apology. "Dear Mrs. Carter, I know I am the last person you want to hear from, but I wanted to take a moment to express my deepest apologies for the way I treated you and your husband on Flight 719. I allowed my personal biases to dictate my actions, and for that, I am truly sorry. There is no excuse for the assumptions I made, and I regret the pain and humiliation I caused. I've recently begun attending workshops and reading more about unconscious bias and its impact. I know this is only the first step, but I wanted you to know that I am actively working to understand and change. Thank you for your grace and composure during that flight. I hope that in time, I can become someone who reflects those same qualities. Sincerely, Emma Scott. Emma stared at the screen for a long moment before hitting send. She knew there was no guarantee Olivia would even read it, but sending the email felt like a small step forward. Meanwhile, Olivia's phone buzzed softly beside her. She glanced down at the new message notification and raised an eyebrow when she saw Emma's name. Nathan noticed the flicker of surprise in her expression. "Who's it from?" he asked. "Emma Scott," Olivia replied, her tone neutral as she opened the email. Nathan leaned forward slightly, waiting for her reaction. After reading the message, Olivia set the phone down with a quiet sigh. "She apologized," she said simply. "Do you believe her?" Nathan asked. "I don't know," Olivia admitted, "but I do believe that people can change if they choose to." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "What are you going to do?" Olivia gave him a small, knowing smile. "I guess we'll see." Title: The Flight That Changed Everything. As Olivia Martinez leaned back in her chair, she crossed her arms and gazed thoughtfully at Nathan. The weight of the day still lingered between them, heavy but not unwelcome. "It's a start," she admitted, setting her glass of water down gently. "But policies and training only scratch the surface. It's the culture that needs to shift." Nathan rested his elbows on the table, his eyes steady on hers. People like Emma need to understand that bias, whether conscious or not, comes with real consequences. Olivia sighed, twirling the edge of her scarf between her fingers. "I think she's feeling those consequences now," she replied. "But whether she's learned from it, well, that's another story." Elsewhere, in a small, dimly lit apartment across the city, Emma Scott sat staring at the termination letter still sprawled across her coffee table. Her phone vibrated every few minutes. Texts from former colleagues, articles linking back to the flight, and news headlines dissecting her downfall. Some messages were curt, expressing disbelief or awkward sympathy. Others were far less kind, condemning her actions and holding her responsible for tarnishing the airline's reputation. Emma hadn't responded to any of them. Instead, she scrolled through comment sections on articles recounting the incident. The headlines left little to the imagination. Flight attendant fired after calling security on Latino couple with valid tickets. Bias in the skies. How one airline faced a reckoning. Emma's name was rarely mentioned directly, but that didn't matter. Anyone who had been on Flight 417 or watched the viral videos recognized her instantly. The comments were brutal. Strangers questioning her professionalism, dissecting her motivations, and even speculating about her personal life. Emma swallowed hard, the weight of exposure pressing down like a vice. For the first time in days, she forced herself to acknowledge the truth. She had made an assumption, a simple, careless one. Olivia and Nathan didn't look like the usual first-class passengers, and Emma had acted on that misguided belief. She had expected her authority to shield her. It hadn't. Instead, it magnified her error for the world to see. Emma opened her laptop with a sigh. Hours passed as she absorbed articles, studies, and videos about unconscious bias, systemic discrimination, and the hidden prejudices embedded within corporate structures. At first, it felt hollow, like she was simply going through the motions. But as she read and listened, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just someone who had made a mistake. She was part of a broader issue, a system that nurtured unchecked authority and rewarded assumptions. Finally, Emma opened a blank email, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to formally acknowledge my actions on Flight 417 and to extend a sincere apology to Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, the crew, and the leadership of this airline. My behavior was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for the harm I caused. While my termination was justified, I am committed to using this experience as a catalyst for growth. I hope to contribute to preventing similar incidents in the future." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she typed, but she didn't stop. She detailed the workshops she had begun attending, the reading she was doing, and the concrete steps she planned to take moving forward. When she finally hit send, the tightness in her chest eased, just a little. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Olivia's quiet influence was reshaping the airline from within. Her recommendations had sparked immediate policy changes, but more importantly, the company's leadership had invited her to participate in a high-profile panel on corporate accountability. At first she hesitated, But Nathan, ever her quiet cheerleader, encouraged her to accept. The panel was held at a prestigious industry conference. CEOs, diversity experts, and activists filled the stage, but Olivia's calm yet powerful words captured the room. "The issue isn't just individual bias," she said, addressing the audience with unwavering confidence. "It's the systems that allow bias to thrive without consequences. If we truly want lasting change, we must address both." The room erupted in applause. But more importantly, long after the panel concluded, attendees lingered to speak with her, asking for advice and pledging their support. For Olivia, it wasn't about recognition. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she and Nathan had. Later that evening, as they shared dinner at home, Olivia glanced at Nathan across the table. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked softly. Nathan smiled, reaching for her hand. "We've done what we could," he replied. "The rest is up to them. But I think we've started something important." Olivia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's not the end," she whispered, more to herself than to Nathan. "It's just the beginning." And she was right. The ripples of Flight 417 extended far beyond the cabin or the airline's boardroom. By the time Olivia and Nathan returned to their everyday lives, the incident had become a national conversation. Social media buzzed with debates on bias and customer service dynamics. Passengers shared their own experiences of discrimination, amplifying the message Olivia had championed. The airline's boardroom, once resistant to sweeping change, found itself under pressure. Olivia was asked to consult on additional projects, helping to implement new training programs focused not just on bias, but on leadership and empathy. Months later, Olivia stood at the front of a packed conference room, presenting updated policies to the airline's executive team. "These changes aren't just about preventing another incident," she told them. "They're about fostering a culture where fairness, empathy, and accountability thrive." The executives nodded, visibly engaged. Nathan watched from the back of the room, pride flickering in his eyes. They hadn't just demanded justice. They had built a foundation for lasting change. As Olivia sat at the edge of the couch, her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. Nathan's voice hummed in the background as he read aloud from his latest article draft. "It's about how staying calm under pressure didn't just help us," Nathan said, glancing up from his laptop. "It shaped the entire outcome for everyone watching." Olivia smiled faintly. "True," she agreed. "But it's exhausting, staying calm while someone questions your right to be there. It takes more strength than most people realize." Nathan set his laptop aside and reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "And you handled it better than anyone could have." Her smile softened. "I shouldn't have had to." "That's why we keep pushing," Olivia said quietly, "so no one else has to." Across the city, Emma Scott sat at the back of a small classroom, surrounded by others attending a seminar on unconscious bias. The air in the room was thick with quiet reflection, each attendee carefully considering the facilitator's question. "What's one assumption you've made about someone that you wish you could take back?" The room fell silent. Emma's palms grew clammy as she avoided eye contact, her heart racing. Then, after a long pause, she spoke up. "I assumed someone didn't belong," she admitted softly, her voice trembling. "Not because of anything they did, but because of how I saw them." The facilitator, a calm and empathetic woman, nodded with quiet understanding. "Recognizing that," she said gently, "is the first step. The next is deciding what you'll do with that awareness." Emma swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. Meanwhile, Olivia's influence continued to reshape the airline's policies. Her consulting work extended beyond one or two meetings. The leadership team welcomed her insights, and she began helping design and implement comprehensive training programs that addressed not only bias, but the power imbalances ingrained in decision-making. One afternoon, Olivia stood before the airline's board, a presentation glowing behind her on the screen. "These changes," she explained, "aren't just about preventing incidents like what happened on Flight 417. They're about creating a culture where every employee feels empowered to act with fairness and integrity." The room was quiet, but she could see the weight of her words settling over the executives. "That's how you protect your passengers and your brand." As the presentation concluded, one of the board members, an older man who had remained silent for most of the meeting, approached her. "We've needed this for a long time," he said quietly. "I'm just sorry it took what happened to you for us to recognize it." Olivia met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "What matters is that it's happening now," she replied. "But it's up to all of you to make sure it lasts." At home, Nathan took a different approach. His background in writing became an outlet, and he began publishing a series of articles about the experience. Rather than focusing on the confrontation itself, he wrote about the broader lessons, the subtle ways bias could influence decisions, and the invisible weight it placed on people's lives. As each piece went live, the response was overwhelming. Readers shared their own stories of injustice in schools, workplaces, and public spaces. One evening, as Nathan closed his laptop, Olivia glanced over from the dining table. "It's getting traction?" she asked. He nodded. "It's resonating with a lot of people." "What's the focus of this one?" Nathan smiled. "The power of staying calm. People underestimate how much control they have in those moments." Olivia leaned back, her gaze distant. "Control," she echoed. "Maybe, but it comes at a cost." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, but you showed them grace when you didn't have to. That's rare." She squeezed his hand, appreciating the sentiment, but knowing the road ahead remained long. Emma's path to rebuilding her life wasn't easy. Finding new employment proved difficult, as most airlines hesitated to hire someone whose actions had made national headlines. But Emma persisted. She attended more workshops and seminars, not because she was required to, but because she wanted to understand. Hearing the stories of others who had faced bias forced her to confront the uncomfortable truths she had ignored. She could no longer deny the role she had played, not just in the incident, but within a system that had allowed her assumptions to guide her decisions unchecked. One evening, Emma sat at her small kitchen table and opened her laptop. She composed an email to the airline's board. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to formally acknowledge my actions on Flight 417 and to offer a sincere apology to Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, the crew, and the leadership of this airline. My behavior was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the harm I caused. Though my termination was justified, I hope to use this experience to grow and contribute to preventing similar incidents in the future." The words poured out, raw and unfiltered. When she finally hit send, it wasn't closure, but it was a step. Months later, the story of Flight 417 still resonated. Media outlets revisited it frequently, holding it up as an example of how small individual acts could expose much larger systemic issues. But Olivia and Nathan had returned to their normal lives, at least as much as they could. One day, as Olivia sat in a meeting room preparing to lead another training session, she received an email from a former flight attendant, Emma Scott. The subject line read, "Thank you." As Olivia opened it, the first sentence stood out. "I've been reflecting on what happened, and I wanted to say that your grace that day changed my life." Olivia's lips curved into a faint smile. It wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Emma's voice trembled as she spoke. "I assumed someone didn't belong, not because of anything they did, but because of how I saw them, and it cost me everything." The room remained silent as her words settled over the group. The facilitator, a woman with kind eyes and a steady presence, nodded thoughtfully. "Recognizing it is the first step," she said gently. "The next is deciding how you'll use that awareness to do better." Emma swallowed hard, the weight of that truth pressing down on her. Time passed, but Emma took those words to heart. She began volunteering with organizations focused on equity and inclusion. At first, she hesitated to share her story. But as time went on, she realized the power in vulnerability. By opening up about her mistakes, Emma hoped to prevent others from making the same assumptions. It was hard work, often uncomfortable, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was contributing to something meaningful. She couldn't undo her actions, but she could ensure that others learned from them. At the airline, the changes Olivia had championed were beginning to take shape. Reports of bias-related complaints decreased steadily. Employees responded positively to the new training programs, and leadership began fostering a more inclusive culture. Clara, the flight attendant who had shown kindness to Olivia and Nathan during that fateful flight, had been promoted to a senior position. Now she worked alongside Olivia, implementing training sessions designed for the entire crew. At every session, empathy and fairness stood at the core. Olivia and Nathan stepped onto another plane. This time, it was for a well-deserved vacation. As they settled into their first-class seats, Olivia glanced around the cabin. "Feels different, doesn't it?" she asked softly. Nathan nodded, his eyes following the calm, professional movements of the flight crew. The atmosphere felt lighter, more welcoming. "It does," he agreed, "like things are starting to change." Olivia leaned back in her seat, letting the steady hum of the engines soothe her. The journey to this point had been long, filled with moments of frustration, anger, and exhaustion. But as the plane climbed into the sky, Olivia felt something else. Pride. They hadn't wanted the spotlight, but change had a way of finding those willing to stand up, even when it wasn't easy. The work wasn't over, but Olivia and Nathan had made a difference. And for now, that was enough. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.